Welcome back, everybody, to the Go podcast. I just want to say thank you all for tuning in. I'm super excited and super blessed to be able to do this. You are my very first guest and for this show, and I'm super excited to kick it off with you. I can't wait to see what comes with it. How I kind of want to do this is I kind of want to give you an introduction before I reveal your name, and then we'll just kind of jump into it.
Sounds good.
So, you are a pastor.
Yep.
And not only are you a pastor, you're the associate pastor of our church, and you were my youth leader, youth pastor. You're the worship leader here.
Yep.
You have a master's degree in theology and biblical studies. You're a CASA volunteer. You're a father of three with a fourth one on the way.
Yeah.
You're a husband. You're a great role model, a great leader, and to me, the most important, you're a great Christian man and an even better friend.
Amen.
So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Josh Slinkard.
Well, thank you, Jordan, for that magnificent introduction. It's great. You need to go everywhere I go and just introduce me like that. I'm very excited to be on this podcast. I can't wait till it's got millions of listeners and you're famous. And I'll say I know that guy. I was the first guest on this podcast, so I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to be on.
Of course. Couldn't have chosen a better person to start it off with. So kind of how I want to kind of approach this. Kind of want to start with kind of like your childhood.
Sure.
Jump into that. How you grew up. If you grew up Christian, if you didn't. Kind of the decisions that led you to Christ, and then specifically in your spot, how those decisions shaped you to become a pastor in the role you're at now.
Right.
Then we'll talk about that. After that, I do want to jump into your first mission trip that you ever took.
Right.
Talk about that, and then we'll talk about the mission trip that we just took to the Dominican,
Right.
and all the ups and downs, the goods, the bads about that. And then just whatever comes up after that. But before we get started, I do want to ask everybody this: what is either your favorite verse, or maybe a verse that kind of drives your day to day, something that you look back to that kind of gives you motivation or just
Sure.
peace?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my favorite verse is in Matthew 5:8. It's blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. It's part of the Beatitudes, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And that has been my favorite verse for a very long time. I can't even tell you why. I just know that at some point when I was younger, a teenager, I was reading through the Bible and I was reading through the Beatitudes and I got to that verse and I just thought, that's what I want to do. I want to be able to see God one day. I want to be pure in heart. So what I did was, in every Bible I've ever had, I've highlighted that pretty much. Now, a funny story about that. I know it's a quick question, but I have a story about that. So, and this kind of goes into my childhood. So this will kind of flow well, I think.
Okay.
My mom grew up they weren't like anti-Christian, but they were just kind of nominally Christian. So they would go to a Presbyterian church, her and her parents, kind of once in a blue moon, but it was, kind of a Christmas Easter kind of thing. And she says she doesn't even remember the Bible being opened or the gospel being preached.
Okay.
So they're kind of cultural Christians, I guess, but it was definitely not a real faith. And then you fast forward and then my grandma, my mom's mom, she had a little kind of ceramic Bible that was on her table where she would do her makeup. And on that little ceramic Bible was Matthew 5:8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Now, all this I'm telling you, I didn't know until we did the Sermon on the Mount class in the Bible. That was a year or two ago. I didn't know the story until then. Okay, so this isn't something I grew up knowing.
Okay.
This is something we did that I said was my favorite verse, and then she told me this after that. So on that little ceramic Bible that my grandma had, it had Matthew 5:8. And even though they didn't really know the Bible, my mom remembers as a child, she'd be there with her mom. Mom's put out on makeup, they're talking, and she would see this little ceramic Bible with a Bible verse on it. So my mom's mom passed away from breast cancer right when my mom was graduating high school. And her parents had not really, she knew her mom was sick. She didn't know her mom was that sick.
Okay.
So when she passed away, it was a real shock. It was a real surprise. And it was, probably the most eventful thing that happened in my mom's life ever. And So she went down to, she had just graduated high school. She went to Texas A&M, Giga Maggie's. By the way, side note, her dad said he would pay for her to go to state college, and she chose A&M because she liked a maroon over burnt orange. So I'm here because of her choice of color.
Nice.
Anyway, so she's going to A&M, and it's just, she's moved away from home. Her mom has just died, and she's just having a really difficult time.
Mm-hmm.
She's not a Christian. She's having a really, really difficult time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's tough anyway when you're adjusting to like moving away from home for the first time, or even
Right.
being away from home for the first time. And here she is, she doesn't even get to call her mom on the phone and tell her how her first class was, all those things. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
really rough time. And there was a night, and she kept waking up and having these dreams.
Okay.
This particular nightmare where her mom was reaching out to her, and she was reaching out to her mom, and she couldn't reach her. So
Hmm.
just awful, right?
Yeah.
And so she woke up one night after this, and she didn't have a Bible, but her roommate did, and her roommate wasn't in the room for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And she grabbed her roommate's Bible, and she turned to the only Bible verse that she knew. The only Bible verse reference that she knew. She didn't even know John 3:16
Mm.
was this Bible verse that had been on her mom's ceramic Bible her entire life, and it was Matthew 5:8. So she turns to Matthew 5:8. She starts reading the Beatitudes, and it says, blessed are those who mourn,
Mm-hmm.
they'll be comforted. Blessed are the poor in spirit. She's reading that, the Beatitudes, and she feels a sense of comfort, this understanding, and it's actually that experience that leads her to Christ.
Hmm. Okay.
So she gets saved, um, at least partially through this, by turning to scripture, and the only Bible verse she knew was Matthew 5:8. Fast forward to me,
Mm-hmm.
she never told me the story. I had no idea. I just grew up loving Matthew 5:8. And it's been my favorite verse. And until a couple years ago or a year ago, I didn't know that story. And so she told me that story, and I mean, I was crying. It was just it was really cool because I felt like I had this connection to my grandma that I did. And my grandma was a believer, even though I didn't really go to church very much.
Yeah.
Like, I never met this woman, obviously. She died when my mom was 18. And so it made that verse that was already important to me even more important
Mm-hmm.
because it's got this legacy of, it was on my grandma's table. It God used it to help lead my mom to Christ in college.
Hmm.
And it's been so important in my life.
Yeah.
So going into my childhood, if you want to
Yeah.
go there
Yeah.
now.
We can.
So both of my parents got saved in college.
Okay.
They both went to A&M. They both got saved in college. Again, not from like atheist homes or anything, but just not, it was just kind of nominally, culturally
Right.
Christian.
Right.
Both of their homes. So they both get saved, and they start volunteering for a ministry on campus called Campus Crusade. It's still around, Campus Crusade for Christ.
Okay.
It's still around. It's called Cru now, CRU.
Hmm.
And it's in all kinds of, it's an international organization. It's an international kind of college ministry organization. They have it at all major universities. I have friends today that work for Cru, and they work with college students in Italy and England, and they do the Jesus film. Like
Oh, okay.
they're
Okay.
doing I've got a friend who's working on the new version of the Jesus film. It was and so Crew was huge, and they met there. Both new believers. They get married
Mm-hmm.
uh, very quickly after college, and they they want to do like short-term mission stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So they start, and this kind of goes into this. They start doing fundraising for missions work.
Okay.
And my mom, they've done mission stuff with Crew. My mom actually went to the Soviet Union while it was still the Soviet Union. That's how
Wow.
old she is. She went to Ukraine and into Russia proper and to different places. And she does a great story where she had actually smuggled a Bible in and gave it to a guy on an elevator because it's the only place where they weren't being watched. I mean, they had people follow them in buses, and they found microphones in their hotel room, and it was, I
Wow.
mean, full like, Soviet Union Cold War stuff. So she had been on mission trip. He had done mission stuff. They, Campus Crusade did like beach reach mission outreach things and all kinds of stuff. So
Mhm.
they're on fire. They just got saved. They just got married, and they want to serve the Lord.
Okay.
So they go to raise support and are just not really able to raise the level of support that they need to kind of do this. So the Lord kind of shuts that door. So they're looking for open doors, and they actually do different things. They run a shelter. They go to California for a little bit. They run a shelter for abused and neglected kids. They do all this stuff.
Wow.
They wind up back in College Station, and at some point, surprise, my mom gets pregnant unexpectedly, unplanned, with me and my twin brother.
Ah.
So she gets pregnant. Uh, my dad's like, "Well, I need to get a job." he gets in. He gets a job into the burgeoning the computer industry, the new industry, right?
Right.
He has like a sociology degree, but it was the late '80s, so they were taking warm bodies
Okay.
to
Yeah.
be in computers. Now you didn't have to have anything.
Uh-huh.
So he gets into network engineering stuff, and we're born 9 weeks early. They have one car. They don't have medical insurance. They have to pay us off like car payments. I mean, and we were born very premature, and I had all kinds of problems. I had a heart murmur. I had a hernia. I was like less than 3 pounds. I mean, it was just um, I, I had to stay in the hospital an extra 2 weeks after my twin brother came home,
Hmm.
and we it was just faith. I mean, they were super young. I mean,
Right.
younger than you. I mean, they're early 20s.
Yeah.
They're like 20 and 21. And here they have twins. And I really appreciate my parents because they didn't get to live the lives in ministry that they had dreamed of. They
Mm-hmm.
weren't able to be missionaries.
Right.
But what they did was several things. So, they raised us all up as Christians,
Mm-hmm.
very involved. We were in church all the time. Um, they read to us, they taught us. They we read books about missionaries. I remember as a kid, the first thing I wanted to be a missionary to China. I
Mm-hmm.
read about Alward, and I read about Hudson Taylor and the Cambridge Seven and all these missionaries to China, and I was like, I want to do that. I want to be a missionary to China. That's like my earliest like remembrance of what I wanted to be growing up.
Mm-hmm.
So they still had that like missions perspective.
Yeah.
They always tithed. I remember my dad. I mean, it was clockwork. My dad always he was always tithing every week. He was always doing 10%. They supported missionaries independently. I mean, it was just a huge part of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
So, I have a twin brother, I have a younger brother. We grew up Christian, and uh, talking about testimony, I remember when I got to be about 14, 15, and maybe a little later, people had all these crazy stories of how, you hear stories from adults, or like, I OD'd in the back of the ambulance, I came to Christ.
Right.
And this is so funny because I remember going like, "Oh man, I don't have a cool story like that." I mean, it's kind of silly to go like, "I wish my life had hit rock bottom so I'd have some cool conversion story."
Right.
But this is what I like to say. In some sense, in a way, I have always been a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
and this is what I mean by that. I believed when I'm younger, when I was a young kid, I just believed what my parents told me. I believed what they told me about Jesus. I believed what the church said.
Mm-hmm.
Like I believed in Jesus as
Right.
early as I believed the stories, all that. Then there becomes a time, and for anybody like you, I'm sure,
Mm-hmm.
you're raised Christian. You probably had a similar experience where, you believe what you're told.
Mm-hmm.
And then there becomes a moment, and it can be different in people's lives, where you kind of have to make the decision for yourself if you're going to kind of stay with it, if it makes sense.
Right.
Are you going to choose to follow Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I made that choice. I remember there was a girl in the youth group, and there was a choir at the church I was going to. And I remember this particular Sunday, she was a great singer, still a good friend of mine, and they're singing this song, and she is singing it, and I can tell these words that she's singing are just so real and
Mm-hmm.
authentic for her. And I remember thinking, man, I want that. I want what she has. I I had the belief, but I wasn't following Christ. I didn't have really the relationship.
Right.
So through that and through everything I knew, I chose to follow Christ. I got baptized, and the my youth group was very influential to me because I grew up homeschooled,
Mm-hmm.
so I didn't have a lot of involvement. And then you're a teenager and you're starting to kind of go on your own thing. And I remember I had this background of my parents, in their mission work and how I wanted to be a missionary. And so I get into youth group, and I don't know, 14, 15.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember going, I want to, I had all these individuals, too many to talk about, who impacted me. And I said, I want to do the same thing for kids when I grow up.
Right.
Okay. So I knew, I don't even know, 14, 15, 16, somewhere in there,
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I was called to ministry. I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what it would look like. Specifically, I knew that I wanted to, whether it was a volunteer or something, I wanted to help kids the way I had adults kind of help guide me and disciple me and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very involved. Interrupt me at any time because
No,
I'm
no,
Australian. Okay.
you're good.
So I was very involved in our church's youth group. I mean, I learned guitar, taught myself guitar, played on the worship team. We had what's called a student ministry team, led by kids. I was on the student ministry team. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there were weeks, this might be funny. There were weeks where we would have Monday morning, we would have, or Tuesday morning, we would have a prayer breakfast before school where we would show up to the church, really early
Mm-hmm.
and eat sausage biscuits and drink hot chocolate. Look too young for coffee and do prayer requests.
Uh-huh.
So we would do that, and then Wednesday night we would have church, and then Thursday night we'd have student ministry team meeting, and then Sunday morning we would have Sunday school, or sometimes we went to nursing homes and like sang and stuff, and then so Sunday school, then we'd have the worship service, and then we might have that afternoon I'd be playing basketball, and it'd be choir practice, and then Sunday night there would be a small groups. So that was my life.
Very
I mean, it
busy.
was, and there might be a Friday, especially when I was driving. I was up at the church um because we had a full-time youth pastor. So there was always somebody there.
Right.
I was up at the church almost every day. I
Hmm.
mean, I was there constantly.
Yeah.
So I remember, as you start to get to like 18 and you and your friends go, oh man, what are we gonna do for college? What do
Mm-hmm.
we want to be? What do we want to do with our lives? You know how it is. It's pressure where you go, you're just a kid and all of a sudden you're trying to make decisions on your entire future, right?
Right.
It's very daunting. Well, I didn't have that. I knew what I wanted to do.
Uh-huh.
That call never kind of strayed with me. And so my dad, he said, okay. And he took me to some preview days at different colleges, and so I went to one preview day
Mm-hmm.
at the Criswell College. I know the listeners can't see it, but I'm drinking coffee out of my Criswell College mug
Yeah.
at Criswell Bible College in Dallas. Um, and I went to one preview day, and it felt like I was at home.
Mm.
And I was like, "This is where I want to go." And I went to that Bible college, and I was my degree back then. Everybody, all the BA was biblical studies with
Mm-hmm.
like instead of minors, they had emphases.
Okay.
So my emphasis, I double emphasized in youth ministry and philosophy. So I had
Okay.
a lot of youth ministry classes, a lot of, and a particular professor there who's now gone to be with the Lord, Professor BB. We called him Professor Baltazar Alvarez, was incredibly influential,
Mm-hmm.
and that'll feed into my first mission trip because I
Okay.
did that with him. And that's how we met.
Mm-hmm.
So you've now popped into the story. The church that I had been going to, it was funny. So I was dating a girl in the youth group. She was a year younger.
Mm-hmm.
So I graduate and she's still in the youth group, and they're like, "Hey, we love you, but," and I wanted to volunteer
Mm-hmm.
because I want to go to college. I want to work in the youth group. And they're like, "Well, you can't volunteer as an adult and date a kid in the youth group, right?"
Right. Right.
Which sounds bad. Again, we were already dating. She was 17. I turned 18 before she did. So what I did for a semester or two, it was I actually had a connection with a Criswell pastor who's pastored FBC Leonard. Okay,
Okay.
so I drove out to Leonard a couple times a week, at least Sunday, Wednesday, and maybe another day. And I interned there,
Okay.
and I helped with the youth group. And I was just there to learn, and I learned a lot. I learned how to do staff meetings. The pastor there, Denny Garina, I'd be there on a day like Tuesday or something, and he would go, "Hey, if you want to be a pastor, you need to learn how to do a funeral for somebody who's not saved." And I would go with him.
Hmm.
He'd be like, "Let's go to the hospital," whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned a lot in a shorter period of time of what the kind of behind the scenes pastoring was, what it
Mm-hmm.
looked like, what ministry was, not just on a Sunday or Wednesday. Um, and then my parents had started going here,
Mm-hmm.
so that girl and I wound up breaking up, as your first romances tend to
Right.
happen, and I started coming here, and so when we met, I was working at a full-time job at the Boys and Girls Club in town.
Mhm.
Again, that was another job. This shows you my focus, or my I had been working at Chick-fil-A, and then a youth pastor in town,
Mhm.
Mike Barron, he came in and he was getting a bunch of gift cards. And I was like, I knew him from things around town, from youth group stuff. And I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" He said, "Well, I just got hired as a youth director, the team director of the Boys and Girls Club. We're doing this program. We need volunteers. You should come volunteer." And I remember going, "Well, I want to work with kids, and I want to be able to have experiences with kids that I didn't grow up with, that aren't just like me,
Mhm.
people of all kind of races and backgrounds and socioeconomic." So I went to volunteer at the Boys and Girls Club,
Okay.
and that turned into an 8-year job where I
Yeah.
became the second highest, the director of operations at that club.
Okay.
So even when I was volunteering, was all geared towards my call to ministry.
Right.
So when we met, yeah, I came here. I was working at the Boys and Girls Club. I was going to Criswell, so I had a full time job. I had a full time school in Dallas,
Mhm.
um, and then I was a part time youth pastor here.
What year was
So
that?
this would have been, let's see, that's a great question. So I think this is 2011, 2012,
Okay.
sometime in then.
Right.
And I started school in 2009, so I was a
Okay.
couple of years into my undergrad degree at that point.
Okay.
So anytime Jordan's younger brother is at Criswell, anytime he complains, I do everything that he did, and then I had another full time job.
Uh-huh.
So anyway,
Yeah.
so yeah, it'd be a lot. 2011, 2012, and it was great. I
Mhm.
was, I mean, it was so busy
Mhm.
between classes and going full time for classes and working a full time job and working here. And it's interesting because sometimes I remember feeling then, and this is good for anybody minister, kind of this imposter syndrome,
Mhm.
because I felt bad because I didn't have the same kind of time or energy to give to you guys that I had gotten from my youth pastor. Because my youth pastors at the church that I had gone to was a little bigger. They had full-time job. That was
Mhm.
their full-time job.
Okay.
So they were like at games, and they were all this stuff, right?
Mhm.
And I just couldn't do that. I mean, there were Wednesdays I'm showing up, and I'm like, I don't know what I'm gonna teach on tonight, because I worked 50 to 60 hours, and I had just had Greek class, and it was kind of overwhelming.
Mhm.
So I um I learned a lot about. I had to wrestle with that,
Right.
and realize, okay, it's different. How do I put my best effort in? How do I give you guys? I can't replicate the same experience necessarily that I had,
Mhm.
but what can I do? And you'll have to comment on that as far as how I did as a youth pastor. But I was mostly focused on. I never wanted to pretend that things weren't the way that they are.
Mhm.
So if people had questions, I didn't know the answer, or whatever it was, or if things were going to be difficult, I just wanted to be as honest and authentic as possible. And working here, I started. This is my 13th year. As a youth pastor, and then 6 or 7 years ago, I became the full-time associate pastor. And after during COVID, I got my master's degree, had a kid, all this stuff.
All that.
So, we kind of got here now. And I know that's a ton of ground, so you probably have stuff in there. But just as a short summary,
Mhm.
my parents weren't raised Christians really.
Mhm.
Both got saved in college, were brought together by the Lord, obviously, and then kind of passed on their legacy of missions minded and ministry to me. And from pretty early age, as a teenager, I felt the call to ministry and never deviated from it.
Yeah.
And even in my like early mid 20s, everything I did, whether it was my interning and then becoming full-time job at the Boys and Girls Club, or here, or at FBC Leonard, or wherever, was kind of focused on this goal of being in ministry, and specifically kind of working with youth.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I like it. Yeah.
I don't know how much of that you already knew, but
Well, there was some stuff that I did know. There was some stuff that I hadn't known before. It does seem like the question I do have for you. It does seem like there's a lot more people, including my brother. There's a lot of people that I know who have taken that step that they said they're being called to ministry.
yeah.
what are some like goal or some advice that you might have to people who
Mhm.
feel like they're being called to ministry, but
Yep.
maybe not exactly know what that looks like?
No, great idea or great question. So first off, I will say if you can do anything but ministry, do that
Mhm.
because ministry done right, you're not going to make a lot of money.
Mhm.
You're not going to have regular hours. Um, and you are going to um, you're going to see people at their worst.
Mhm.
Um, in different ways. Now, I know you've trained as a paramedic and things. You've seen people at their worst as well. But
Mhm.
what I mean by that is, um, as a pastor or in ministry, and of course, my experience is different kinds of pastor: youth pastor, worship pastor, associate pastor.
Right.
But when you're in ministry, that means you're working with people,
Mhm.
and uh, when you are a pastor, I guess this is more pastor specific. If you're any kind of pastor, that you're a shepherd of people, and that means you're going to bear their burdens. You know, Jimmy talks about it, our pastor here. I'll talk about how you sip the cup of sorrow,
Mhm.
and it can be overwhelming because you go around and you're sipping this cup of sorrow. You're sharing this sorrow, these burdens of all these people.
Mhm.
Now, not the full load, but still, you are bearing each
Right.
other's burdens, and you are, I think about, um, I remember being in a room at the hospital for the first time. I'm there with the family, and their father's been brought in, and they thought, they knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what it was. And I was there just kind of be with them and pray with them and encourage them.
Mhm.
And remember the doctor coming in and just saying, we lost him, and everybody's kind of shocked.
Mm.
And I remember the cry of the wife, and I mean I can hear it,
Mhm.
and so you start to do those things, and don't get me wrong, it's amazing. I love my job. You
Mhm.
say the job, I love to be in ministry. You get the joys and the highs as well.
Right.
But for anybody, if you can do anything else, do it, because there's going to be uh kind of the dark moments of the soul, as they say. There's going to
Right.
be moments where you're in the valley of the shadow of death, and if you're not actually called,
Mhm.
if God hasn't actually called you to ministry, I don't know how you endure those things.
Right.
So first off, if you can do anything else, do something else. Secondly, if you're called to ministry and you don't know what exactly, that's okay.
Mhm.
I thought I was going to be a youth pastor
Right.
the rest of my life. I didn't, there's the old school was like, well, everybody's got to be a youth pastor and you got to be a senior pastor. That's kind of gone out the window.
Mhm.
You don't have to do that. And so I thought I'm going to be a youth pastor, and I'm going to be a youth pastor forever. And then maybe you guys broke me. I was like, oh, I can't do it. No. But then, I transitioned into this associate pastor role, and I'm an elder now,
Mhm.
and, have done and do worship. And I loved being a youth pastor. There might be a day where I step back in and help with that role,
Mhm.
and help with youth. And I still have that passion for youth. But
Right.
the thing is, if you're called to ministry, you just follow the Lord's leading, and I have always gone with, I'll go where I feel like I have a peace from the Lord to do it.
Mhm.
So early on, I got an offer from a church to be the worship leader and the youth pastor. And this is before I had a job in ministry and I was working at fast food,
Mhm.
and it was more money than I'd have ever, and it was probably like 30 grand, but I was
Right.
making like 12, you know what I
Right.
mean? So
Right.
it was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. It was a full-time ministry job. It was closer to the school.
Mhm.
I mean, everything on paper, the world would have said, take this job.
Mhm.
But I didn't feel peace about it. And there were some kind of red flags for me, and I turned it down. And it was a really good decision that I didn't take that job. So if you're feel called to ministry, make sure that you are.
Mhm.
Okay, first off. Secondly, don't be concerned if you don't know what your role is going to be, because it can shift.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk to anybody in ministry, our pastor, he was in full-time missions.
Yeah.
And now he never thought he was going to be a senior pastor of a church. I never thought I'd be an associate pastor of a church. I never thought I'd be a worship leader. I mean, you
Right.
just don't know. So just follow the Lord's leading, the Holy Spirit's leading.
Mhm.
Go where you feel that peace, and don't worry too much about what it's going to look like 20, 30 years later. Because
Right.
here's the thing, when you're in ministry, you shouldn't care about titles.
Mhm.
I don't care. You can call me. Some people still call me the youth pastor. They'll be like, "This is our youth pastor." I'm like, "I haven't been a youth pastor in like 5 years, but it
Right.
doesn't matter." Uh, the titles don't matter. It's all about kind of the role and what God's called you to. And
Mhm.
I have people that look at me and go, wait a minute, you've been there 13 years. You know, you've been an associate pastor all this time. You have a master's degree. Like, why don't they'll say this way? Why don't you go take a church? Why don't you go be a senior pastor somewhere?
Mm-hmm.
I'll say, I haven't felt that call. I'm not going to, I could wake up tomorrow and feel like God's called me to go be a lead pastor of a church
Mm-hmm.
or be a worship pastor or be a missionary to China. I mean, that
Yeah.
was my first love. I wouldn't say no to that. But I haven't felt that call. I haven't felt that peace, that direction from the Lord. So until He tells me to leave,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm just gonna stay here and keep
Yeah,
plugging away.
that makes sense. That makes sense. You can't force something like
Yeah,
that.
I see people do it. You know, I
Mm-hmm.
see. We have in the ministry. We call it, church hopping. We'll see. There'll be pastors, and I'm not talking bad about anybody specifically, but you'll see them where they're at a church for a year to 3 years, and then they're always trying to jump to a larger church.
Mm,
And their goal is they want to be a pastor of a really big church. There's nothing wrong with being a pastor of a really big church, but I do think there's something wrong if that's your goal,
right.
or if that's your motivation for
Mm-hmm.
everything, because the Lord might be calling you to be faithful um, at a smaller church.
Mm-hmm.
And I this is and I tell I mentioned this before because Jimmy's been here almost 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
and so there's a large church in Seattle that Mark Driscoll started. Um, what was it? There's another church like it with the same name that Rob Bell had. What was the name of that church? Mars Hill.
Okay.
Mars Hill in Seattle. And I like to say Jimmy Mars Hill, when Mars Hill started, Jimmy was already the pastor of this church.
Mm-hmm.
Mars Hill got up to a million tons of campuses, hundreds of thousands of members, huge mega church,
Right.
gigantic mega church. Then through different actions, it completely imploded, and it is no more.
Hmm.
The Mars Hill, with all these hundreds of thousands of people or tens of thousands of people and all these campuses and stuff, it is no more. It doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And Jimmy's still the pastor here. So you could look at it if Jimmy could have looked at his pastor and go like, well, wait a minute, why am I not like that? Why don't I have 10,000 people? Why don't I have 6 campuses? I've
Right.
been plugging away here. But it's about the faithfulness to what you're called to do,
Mm-hmm.
because you can have things rise and fall. There's a really good podcast called The Rise and Fall of Marcel about that. And it's about, are you being faithful with God's given you?
Mm.
And if He's given you something small, there's a quote from a theologian who I love, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I'm probably going to butcher the quote, but it's something along the lines of what is small and trifling to us may be great and glorious to God.
Mm.
And so the way that we see it, some pastors see it as like, oh, if you're not a pastor by this time, I would be looked at. You're 13 years in the ministry. You've been an associate pastor this time. I've got a bunch of friends who are senior pastors, and they would look at me, not my friends, but just this people who have this mindset.
Yeah.
They look at me and be like, "Oh man, you're not a senior pastor. Like, what's going on?" I'm just trying to be faithful to what God has called me to do.
Right.
So
Nice. Nice. Well, I was a quick question. I kind of want to jump back just a
yeah,
couple things. Whenever you said about sipping from the cup of sorrow,
sure,
so obviously that can take kind of a toll
yeah,
on anybody's mental health and stuff. What are some things that you personally do that maybe helps alleviate some of that,
yeah.
or just kind of give you more mental clarity whenever you're going through the trenches of stuff like that?
Well, there's a few things. There's one, and I'll be very open about this. You know, I sometimes I eat ice cream. Sometimes, and obviously, I mean, you look at me. I mean, and I say jokingly, but it is one of my stress relief is kind of is eating ice cream or
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Right.
And that's not the right way to do it. That's not what I recommend. And there's other worse ways to self-medicate,
True. True.
I guess. So I don't do those, but yeah, I mean, that's kind of the bad way. So if my wife knows if I have a really hard day and I'm eating a pizza by myself, then yeah, it's been a really bad day. But
Huh.
on the positive side, what I would recommend, don't go down that road.
Yeah.
Don't self-medicate. And this trend, I mean, the trend of like pastors committing suicides actually is up a lot,
Hmm.
and having mental health problems and self-medicating with drugs, alcohol, whatever, is on the rise. I think it's for this reason. It's
Mm-hmm.
because we live in a broken, sinful, fallen world, and it's not getting any better.
Right.
And so you sip that cup of sorrow, and it's tough to not kind of self-medicate in a bad way.
Right.
On the positive side, though, one I'm blessed with is I have other people in ministry with me.
Mhm.
So, your brother Jimmy, there's pastors out there who I have real sympathy for because they're basically by themselves.
Mhm.
And thankfully, I have other people here, other elders, deacons, pastors who know what it's like
Mhm.
and that I can share that burden with, who I can say like, "Hey, I just need a day. I can't, whatever it is." And
Yeah.
they're more than helpful. And I can do the same with them. So part of that is kind of you can't hold it all, right?
Right.
It's not all on you. You've got to give it to the Lord. You've got to share with other people, the people ministry you're with, and kind of help them help you. I mean, a lot of pastors, I think, feel like I'm supposed to be the shepherd. I'm carrying the burden. Well, we're not doing this alone. There's other people um, alongside you. I mean, we have a ministers' fellowship here, and part of that fellowship, we meet once a month. We pray for each other. We love on each other. I have friends around town who are other pastors who, if I'm going through a rough patch or they're going through a rough patch, we can kind of support each other.
Mhm.
So that's one way, a positive way to do it is kind of lean on the other laborers in the
Mhm.
Lord's ministry with you. The other one is I think that you have to, um, it, in a way, you have to get into the mindset that that it's a blessing.
Right.
So when people allow you in their lives to minister to them and you're sipping that cup of sorrow
Mhm.
with them, that is a blessing. That isn't like we live in a world where sorrow is bad and like joy is good,
Mhm.
but that's way too simplistic. Sorrow is not evil.
Mhm.
Sorrow is part of being in this world.
Right.
And Um, there's Jars of Clay, which you might not know. They're kind of an older band now, but they had an album called Shelter. And the concept of the album was that we as Christians are supposed to be each other's shelter.
Mhm.
And being people allowing you in their lives to minister alongside with them, to minister to them, and to sip that cup of sorrow with them is such a blessing. And it may not be a joy in that moment. It may not be a happy thing. It may not give you all these like positive feelings,
Mhm.
but it is like if you're called to do it, if you can have that mindset of this is a blessing, and I learned that from Jimmy, I learned that from others.
Yeah.
So I would say that, like, try not to self medicate. That's I mean, eat food or whether it's fast food or anything like that.
Right.
Instead, like, turn to your brothers and sisters in ministry you can kind of lean on. Of course, you need to know where they're at
Mhm.
because you don't want to add too much to their plate. So, you know, um, and then the second positive thing I would say is, if you can, shift your perspective around, and you can get this perspective shift through scripture, through theologians. There's all kinds of great resources about this,
Mhm.
where about how this is actually a blessing. There's a book called "Beautiful and Terrible Things," and it was written by a man he's a pastor and he's also a professor in the Old Testament, and he lost his son at 9 to like a rare blood disorder.
Mm.
And that was a book that's been very helpful to me because he has this perspective of both an academic and a pastor and a father, and he walks through that. And the name of the book comes to this poem, and I don't know, I can't remember who wrote it off the top of my head, but it talks about how in this life you will go through beautiful and terrible things, but God is with you.
Mhm.
And I do it. My favorite sermon that I've ever preached, and I've preached it here, I've preached it at other churches, um, is where is the God who mourns.
Mhm.
This is the title of the sermon, and it takes the world. This is the comfort that the world gives you when like bad things happen, and it's all like everything happens for a reason, and all these things, right? That's not really biblical. It's kind of a misinterpretation.
Mhm.
And I have these are the three comforts that Scripture gives you, and
Yeah.
the three comforts of Scripture is that God is with us in a real way,
Mhm.
that God mourns with us. I use the story of Jesus and Lazarus. Jesus goes to the tomb, Lazarus' tomb. He's about to raise him from the dead. He knows he's about to raise him from the dead, and he cries.
Mhm.
Well, why is he crying? He's not crying because Lazarus is dead. If you read the passage, it's the tears of the people, the
Mhm.
friends and family of Lazarus who loved him, that bring him to tears. So God is with us. God mourns with us, and God is coming back for us.
Mhm.
Those are the three comforts of Scripture. So, trying to keep that perspective that the joys, the weddings, the baby births, the spiritual breakthroughs, the heights of the mission trips, where you can talk about a minute about mission trips. I don't know
Yeah.
what you want to get to that. You get to do all that too. I
Mhm.
mean, there's all kinds of wonderful, joyous, happy things I get to be a part of. The other side of that sometimes is, you're helping do a funeral for a 9-year-old.
Right.
And you know, it's okay to
Mhm.
cry. It's okay to mourn. It's just like what St. Paul says, who says, we mourn,
Mhm.
but we don't mourn as the Gentiles do. We don't mourn as those who have no hope.
Mhm.
So you're there, you make all these hospital visits, you see people, and you have that. There's always hope
Yeah.
because as Christians, you never say goodbye.
Right.
You see, it's always see you later, even if it's someone on their deathbed. So
Yeah.
keeping that perspective, and not trying to hold it all in,
Mhm.
cry about it. It's fine. I
Mhm.
mean, me, I'll cry on stage. Let it out, in a healthy way to the right people,
Right.
and just kind of be open and honest
Mhm.
with the Lord. I mean, there's times when I'm crying out in the shower, to God, or on the road, and sometimes I'm angry, and I
Mhm.
let him know about it. He's a big God; he can handle it.
Right.
But it's never without hope. It's never in despair.
Yeah.
So that it's a cup of sorrow, but it's not a cup
Mhm.
of despair.
Right.
There's always hope.
That's great. I mean, that's good enough advice for even people who aren't in ministry.
Sure.
Just
Yeah.
to
That's just a Christian perspective on
Mhm.
on grief. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, unless there's anything else you want to talk about on that
No,
topic,
no.
I say we jump into the
Let's
missions.
do it.
So, most people, in my perspective, when people think of missions, they usually always think of going overseas, going to
Yes.
another country. But that's not always the case.
Sure.
There's um, a good leader here who has said it many times that your mission field is wherever your feet are.
Yes.
So your first mission trip was not overseas.
It was not. No,
Yeah.
no. So my first mission trip was a official mission trip. Now I had done, we actually did some stuff in Greenville. We had Mission Greenville, and we did
Right.
things here, obviously. But my first mission trip was with Criswell, and it was with that youth ministry professor, Professor Alvarez, who's gone to be with the Lord. And I can't say how much I love and cherish that man. And it was to
Okay.
Brownsville, Texas. And I remember we go, Texas is so big, you drive like 9 hours.
Right.
You go through like a border checkpoint,
Uh-huh.
to get to Brownsville. So we're in Brownsville, obviously a large Hispanic population, and we have a connect with the church there. And it is, because it was like a mission practicum, those of us who are youth ministry emphases people,
Mhm.
um, they basically were like, okay, here's the youth group, you guys run it. So we kind of split up. During the day we would do like service projects,
Mhm.
and at night we would do services. So when we would switch around, I would get to preach, I would lead worship, we would switch it up
Yeah.
with the rest of us. And that was really cool because that was really practical experience,
Right.
and it I mean, it wasn't an international mission trip, but we were in, of course, Brownsville itself has a high Hispanic population, and
Mhm.
people from Mexico, and specifically, and where we were churches where, and some of what we did was like Spanish speaking only, or Spanish speaking dominant. And so there was, that was kind of my first experience,
Mhm.
and I picked up some Spanish, from a little personal experience. I know a little bit,
Yeah.
and able to get around. And even though it was in Texas, it felt in a way kind of like going to a foreign country, just because it was a lot different than my own experience. And
Right.
you probably could have had the same thing if I'd gone to like Chicago,
Yeah.
just somewhere culturally different.
Mhm.
Texas just happens to be so big that you can go to different ends of it and get a different experience than
Yeah.
maybe that you grew up with. So that was my first experience going to Brownsville. And I had actually, until we went to the Dominican together, I'd never done an international mission trip.
Mhm.
I know my wife had, my
Yeah.
parents had, and all that, but I had never gone on an international mission trip before.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was there? What was something that you kind of pull or remember the most, or kind of pull from that mission trip to Brownsville that really sticks to you
hmm
the most? Is there anything?
Yeah, so I made friends that
Mhm.
some of them I'm still friends with some of the kids and the workers there. And so part of it was the connections. We did, even though we were only there for like a week,
Mm-hmm.
when you're spending all day with people and then at night you're doing services with them and you're eating with them and all this kind of stuff, I mean, I know it's an overused phrase, you're living life with them. You get connected in this way. You're removed from everything you're familiar with, and
Mm-hmm.
you're in a sense you're totally dependent on them,
Right.
right? Um, and you become even this for this week, you're connected in this way that is it's just like I feel closer, and this goes to the Dominican too, although we're not there.
Yeah.
I feel closer with both the people that I went to minister with and the people that I ministered alongside or ministered to than some people I've known like all my life.
Right.
It's just such an intense experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I have friends, you know, some of the students at Criswell that I went on that trip with, I'm closer with to this day. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it was like one mission trip for a week, and we still talk about it.
Yeah.
It's the intensity of the experience. You're out of your comfort zone. You're put into this scenario, into this context where you don't, you know, you're not probably comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, you make these, I guess some people might say you're trauma bonding. And maybe you are in like a positive way, because
Right.
it's not traumatic in a negative way. It's just it's so different. It kind of forces you to be vulnerable. It
Yeah.
forces you to make connections. It forces you to step out in faith in a way that it's hard to replicate that
Right.
artificially. It
Right.
kind of has to be authentic. So
Yeah.
I pulled that from the first trip, and it fed into the second one too,
Mm-hmm.
for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the connection part about it is insane. Just
Yeah.
the feeling of love and brotherhood, sisterhood, whatnot.
Yeah.
Just while you're there, it's almost like people that you met less than a week ago feel like you've known forever.
Yes. That's a great
So,
point.
but well, we can jump right
Sure.
into the Dominican. So
Yes.
this is your first international
It
trip. It's
is.
not your first time overseas
No, no,
in general,
no, it's not. But
but
yeah,
your
first
first.
such trip, yeah.
So kind of leading up to the mission trip, before we even step on the plane,
Hmm.
even maybe before you decided to say yes,
Yeah.
what's kind of going through your head about it?
Well, I I knew that I wanted to do
Mm-hmm.
an international trip, and I wanted to do one for our church, and our church hadn't done one in a while. And it was kind of one of those like when it was okay, we're going to do this. It it was I felt immediately that I was supposed to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like we talked about before in my life, I once I feel that kind of call, I don't really question it.
Right.
It's like when I felt like God wanted me to go back to school, I just did it. Didn't matter. It was like in the middle of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna say like I'm always great at that, but I try to be.
Yeah.
I couldn't say no.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I knew who I trusted. Obviously, the leadership in our church. I know the individual who kind of heads up that mission down there.
Yeah.
So and I liked what I heard about what we were going to be doing,
Right.
because I and you've been on more international mission trips than I have for sure. You've been all over. I don't want to spend the money
Mm-hmm.
and the time, leave my family, and there is a little danger involved always, of
Just a little
course. I
bit.
mean, you're in
Yeah.
the middle of God's will. As Jimmy says, you're the safest you can be is in the middle of God's will, but still, there's a little bit of
Right.
that anxiety.
Right.
I don't want to do that if if what we're going to be doing is just kind of window dressing.
Yeah.
I want it to be impactful. I
Mm-hmm.
want it to be, why am I going, instead of just sending 3 grand down to wherever.
Right.
Like, it needs to be something that's not just worth it for me, but worthwhile to, I'm a sense in, even if I self fund,
Mm-hmm.
I'm investing in myself to do something there for the kingdom of God, and it needs to be meaningful. It needs to be impactful.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be a good stewardship of that time and everything.
Right.
So that's going through my mind, but I'm comfortable with what we're doing. I know who we're doing it with.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going with veterans. I was going with Jimmy and Jeff, who've been
Mm-hmm.
on so many trips,
Right.
and so I was like, if I'm going to do a trip, my first international mission trip, this felt like one where it was a good mix of me being out of my comfort zone, but not like fearful.
Right.
Um, because of the people that I was going with. Now, I thought that was going to be the case. And then I don't know if you want to get into this now, but we that first night.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jimmy was supposed to go with us, and he got delayed
Oh, that's right.
because
That's
brother
right.
buddy. So, a dear friend of mine, kind of grandfather in the faith, Lieutenant Colonel Buddy Crump. He passed away shortly before the trip, and in fact, I didn't even know if I was going to go
Mm.
until his daughter reached out to me and said, Buddy would want you to go.
Mm-hmm.
Buddy was so excited for us to go, and Buddy even gave us money to spend down there, which that's a whole other story. So Jimmy stays back to the funeral. I go.
Mm-hmm.
Jimmy and I are going to stay together. And we go from here. We go to Miami. We get down there. That whole thing. We get to the hotel, which
Yeah, we can
and
talk about
I'm
that
in
later.
I'm in the hotel room, and I'm alone.
Mm.
Like you're with your brother, everybody, Jeff and Melinda, together, all that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, this is exactly what I didn't want.
Right.
Okay, I'm by myself in this hotel room. Um, I don't know what I'm doing. All this kind of stuff. And Jimmy's not here. And
Mm-hmm.
Jimmy's like my safety blanket, my big old safety blanket.
Yeah.
And he's a mission trip veteran. He's not here yet. Now he came back. The next day he came.
Right.
So I'm in this. It's late. By the time we get through everything, it's late. People are
Yep.
going to sleep. I'm in there. I'm laying in the bed, and all of a sudden I hear drip, drip, drip. The AC unit is leaking, and it's leaking bad. So I go downstairs and I'm asking for see if someone can fix it. Well, it's too late. Nobody can fix it. And I'm like, well, I need something because it's so hot. Like I'm a big dude. I ain't sleeping without, I don't want to sleep without the AC if I don't have to.
Right.
I don't want to leave the window up anyway. So they give me like an ice bucket. So anyway, I'm spending, I don't get a lot of sleep. I've got towels and buckets and I'm trying to keep the water's just dripping.
Mm.
It was a miserable first night. And I remember laying there going, oh my goodness, like, am I gonna be able to do this?
Mm-hmm.
So it was quite the culture shock. It was quite the straight into the fire for me. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, obviously, but it was.
Right.
I thought, okay, I'm going with everybody. I'm rooting with Jimmy. Like I'm able to ease my way into this.
Yes.
And the very first night, I'm laying there. It's loud.
Yep.
My AC's not really working. It's dripping, and I'm trying to block out the sound of the drip so I can try and get some sleep because we're waking up early,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm an elder and a pastor, and Jeff's there thankfully too. But with Jimmy not there, I'm one of the leaders,
Right.
and people are looking to me for direction and what we're doing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I have no idea what we're doing.
Uh-huh.
So that was my first night in the Dominican. Was now a few nights after that was I think our second to last night. Jimmy of course was there, and our AC unit gave out completely, and so I went around trying to find a room where we could sleep. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, it was
Yeah. Yeah.
it was quite the trip.
It was. And before we end, I'll
Yeah.
jump to a funny story about that hotel specifically that we found out a little bit later. But anyways, so the first night, pretty stressful and stuff. But after that,
Yeah.
it's basically straight VBS for the next 4 days.
Yeah. So and you had a different experience than I
Mhm.
did. So as one of the things that I had was I didn't have a specific role in the VBS.
Mhm.
Um, w- I was kind of tasked with doing kind of pastoral care for the pastors.
Mm.
So I spent a lot of time with like Brother Menor and
Right.
Kelvis and some of the pastors there. Well, one, because I could kind of communicate with them. I don't speak like tons of Spanish. I speak enough Spanish to get I guess I spoke more Spanish than pretty much anybody in our
You
group.
did, and you're almost our saving grace driving around
Yeah.
Dominican.
So that was fun because I was able to communicate with him, and I that was we would do things kind of in support of you and the VBS, but we'd also just do things to help the pastors around there.
Mhm.
The one thing Jimmy and I spent like half a day finding a basketball goal because they just had this like plywood back thing for the kids, and one of the cool times is we're doing this with Pastor Kelvis. It's lunchtime and we go to eat this place, and it's a really nice part of town, and he usually doesn't get to do this, and we're sitting there just talking to him, and he's having a really great time, and we're encouraging him. So part of it, I kind of feel spoiled because I know you were doing games and all that, and just doing straight VBS. Well, first of all, for me, part of it was I was preaching.
Mhm.
So we get there on a Saturday, I
Think so.
and the next day I'm preaching.
Yeah.
And I thought I was preaching at the Spanish speaking church.
Oh, that's
So I was actually going to do the sermon in Spanish.
Mhm.
I'd written Spanish. And then I'm told, oh, no, 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 actually, you're doing the Haitian church.
Oh, yes.
Well, I don't speak Haitian Creole. So that was a crazy experience.
Yes.
Because I've never preached with an interpreter.
Mhm.
It's hot. I'm dressed up. We are these, you know, a lot of these Haitian Creoles, some of them are refugees. You
Mhm.
know, there's a guy that stands up. Were you in the church with us that day?
I think so.
Yeah, he stands up and he's like, I just, you know, he's from Haiti and he was a pastor there, and gangs came and took over his
That's
house and his
right.
church, and he
I
fled.
remember that.
It was, and you're like, oh my goodness,
Right.
right? So I'm there preaching, and I do the guy who mourns.
Yeah.
That's this. I do that
Yeah.
sermon for them, a modified version of it,
Mhm.
because and so that was crazy. You get there, you have this line, and you're like, okay, you got to be on. You know, you
Uh-huh.
got these are, and this is maybe the first time that they have somebody from the States. I know Brother Earl's done things, but other than him to
Yeah.
preach. And
Mhm.
anyway, that was that you're right into it. And then, like you're talking about, it's you're getting to know these people and form relationships, and doing ministry and doing worship services and preaching and praying.
Mhm.
And there was one service where this is part of it where you know, I know how to play guitar, I know how to sing.
Mhm.
Well, we do this part of my favorite moment was me and Sammy and the others who uh we do this worship service in half English, half
Yeah.
Spanish. And so I'm singing in Spanish, I'm singing in English, we're playing together. And it was kind of just, hey, do you guys want to do this? And we spent the afternoon trying to get it together and
Right.
and we did the evening service, and we're singing these songs, you know, in Spanish and in English. And it was cool
Mhm.
because, and you've probably felt this when you're on the mission field like that, not everything is going to be as structured. Not the agendas aren't going to work, but there's this kind of freedom where you don't feel the same sense of maybe trepidation about doing something like this, because
Mhm.
you're there. It's kind of
Uh-huh.
like winning in Rome, you
Right.
know. So I did things there. I preached. I led worship in Spanish and English. You know, I'm all this stuff, right?
Mhm.
And getting to know these Haitian and Dominican pastors, and it was great, man. I
Yeah.
mean, driving all around trying to find a basketball hoop. I mean, you know, you just find yourself in mission trips doing some of the just crazy
Yeah.
things, you know, that
Mhm.
you never think you're gonna do. So
Yeah. No, that was it's funny because the way that kind of that mission trip was pitched almost
yes,
was it was an easier mission
yes,
trip, a kind of like a get your foot toes
yes,
wet.
yeah,
But honestly,
yeah.
like that was with the language barrier and just
The
everything that
accommodations.
yes, it was a very it was not a get your toes wet. You
Yeah.
were jumping in or you were jumping out.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Oh, I'm glad to hear that in a sense, because you know, I know you've been on these like Nepal and Africa and all these places, and so it's nice to know that it wasn't necessarily the easiest thing ever, because I was like, man, if this is the easiest,
Uh-huh.
and then you'll probably second me on this. My favorite time on this trip, where I probably learned the most
Mhm.
about ministry, was our debriefs. So
Mm.
every night we would go back to the hotel, we would sit there and we would just debrief.
Yeah.
And some of the people, you know, when like the time when Misty shared,
Mhm.
or when Dr. Goodwin talked and did
Yeah.
her story, like, and we're sitting there all in tears, and you have this, like, I don't know, it was, you know, sitting in that room with the lights and the roaches and all that stuff after a hard day. It's hot, sweaty. You're dealing with all these, you know, hundreds of kids, all this stuff.
Mhm.
You know, the traffic's crazy, the people, all this
Right.
stuff, and you go, um, it's indescribable.
Yeah.
You feel the Holy Spirit
Mhm.
in ways that it's I don't know. I don't know the, like, maybe this is the correct theological way to say it, but you just feel the Spirit more poignantly,
Mhm.
more directly. And I think part of it is that you got nothing.
Mhm.
You're exhausted. You have no reserves. You're uncomfortable. You're out of place, and yet you feel so connected.
Right.
You feel so, you know, you have one purpose, and
Mhm.
you're all there together. I don't know. I couldn't. I want to trade those debrief sessions where we're there. Just, I mean,
Mhm.
it's indescribable. I will say this for anybody who hasn't gone on a mission trip like that. You know, if you're going, well, I don't know if I should.
Mhm.
And what I didn't expect, I know you're going to ask for this, but one of the things that I didn't expect was how much it changed me.
Mhm.
Um, was that the first mission trip you did to?
No, the Nepal was
Or
the very
Nepal? Okay,
first
so
one.
you've been to
Dominican
Nepal.
was the
So
second.
I don't know if you had experience in Nepal or not, but
Mhm.
you you go there and you go like, oh, I'm different.
Yeah.
Like, I will never be the same.
Mhm.
And I don't know, you know, how much I did. I hope that I was a good steward and brought the Lord glory, and did those things. But even coming back, there's a little bit of me in the DR.
Yeah.
And I still keep up with Kelvis and Sammy and other people.
Right.
Um, Brother Earl, obviously.
Hmm.
But yeah, there's a part of you that just it changes you, man.
Yeah,
It
it does.
changes you.
It does. And yeah.
And then we went what was it, the last kind of full day or whatever it was when we went up kind of the mountains when we got closer to the Haiti border, and we went up to what was that? What was the town? I can't remember the town's name off the top of my head,
Was it
but
Monte Cristo?
Monte Cristo. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it was Monte Cristi, maybe
Something like
Yeah,
Monte Cristi or
yeah,
something
Monte
like that.
Cristi. Yeah, Mount of Christ. Yeah,
Yeah.
Monte Cristi.
Hmm.
And they had built this, and that was. And you have to tell me. Jeff was like, "This is what you put more mud on these, and it's basically Africa."
Basically, yeah, pretty much.
And there's no electricity except in this church. And they just built this church, and they're getting it going. You have all these kids who most of them haven't seen white people
Hmm.
before. A lot of them for sure. And that was like a whole nother experience.
Yeah, it
You're like,
was.
we were in Santiago
Hmm.
for a few days, and we got our bearing, and we knew
Hmm.
we were going. Remember, we'd go. We did this place, and I'm
Yep.
directing, and you, me, and Jared go to the church, and
Yep.
you figure out all the little weird things about the hotel,
Yep. Yep.
like, okay, you're gonna go to the bathroom with a flip flop because there's gonna be roaches, all that
Uh-huh.
stuff, and you feel comfortable.
Yeah.
And then you're like, boom, we're in this other place and we're uncomfortable again.
Yes. Yes.
And we weren't in a touristy part. We weren't on the southeast side of the island where it's all beaches and stuff. We were in
Nope.
the north, and there's poverty, and it's just real ministry. So
Right.
that was cool. And when we
Hmm.
got to go to the ocean
That was really cool.
and the workers who
Hmm.
worked with us, the who were there, and we got to just hang out.
Hmm.
That was so much fun too.
That
I
was.
mean, it's just even thinking about this, I mean, I could tear up right now. It, it's indescribable. I mean, I
Hmm.
will remember these experiences for the rest of my life. I really want to go back to the DR. I'm planning on going back this year, and then my wife and I are expecting another kid about the same time. So as we're gonna go, so I think I may have to wait another year,
Hmm.
but yeah, it's changed me, and
Yeah.
I will always. I don't know how often I'm going to be able to go on trips, but I mean, as whenever I feel the Lord's call to do it, I plan on doing it.
Hmm.
And I'm forever changed. I'll never be the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned something about like the impact you had. Just looking at the relationship between you and Kelvis,
Mhm.
like you can definitely tell that there was change. You did impact him a lot,
Yeah.
and so, but everything about that trip, from the the worship music
Yeah.
to the VBS to the the second to last night, or the last night when we went up to the upper
The,
room,
the restaurant.
the
Yeah.
restaurant.
Communion.
Yes, that was really cool, because that was probably, for me, one of the most intimate times
Yes.
I've ever taken communion
Yeah.
before.
That was awesome.
Hmm.
And what was it? It was like a chip and like mango juice or
Something
whatever.
like that. Uh-huh. But
That was great because all that's kind of behind you, and it's
mhm.
just y'all to get, it's all up there. And then we couldn't all fit in the van going back, so
Yep.
you and I walked back.
Yeah.
There we all just walked back.
Walk
That
back.
was fun.
That was really cool, because we
Yeah.
got to explore a little bit on foot what the streets of
Yes.
Santiago was like.
Yeah. Which I always felt safe.
I never felt.
There's women and children going around everywhere. It wasn't, and because it wasn't a high tourist area, there wasn't as much kind of like crime and stuff.
No,
So
no, I never once felt like I was in danger.
yeah.
But that leads to the funny story about our hotel rooms. So I I guess I'll explain it a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah.
So we go to this hotel. It looks like it's straight out of the 1950s or
Oh yeah.
something. You've got old metal keys that open doors that have cracks in it
Yeah.
that you could see through. So it was.
The front door just opened to the
Yep,
hotel to the
yep.
street. You
It's
just
just
wandered on.
open. You could literally probably push the doors down to the room.
Yes.
Anyways, this was, I don't know, it was like the third or fourth night we were there. Me and my brother, we stayed in the same room together. Well, like everyone seemed to have the same problem. Our AC finally decided to give up.
That's right.
So we're trying to figure out what to do. Me and him don't have a lick of Spanish in us. Our phones don't work, so we can't use Apple Translate to help. So we're trying to gesture our way to this attendant
Yeah.
that, can you fix the AC? Can you switch rooms?
Yeah.
Anyways, well, Jared stays behind. It leads me down to the front desk, because I'm gonna go. He's like, we'll trade keys and you get the room next to us.
Uh-huh.
So I go down there, and I'm sitting at the front desk with a dude, and he grabs my key that doesn't have a number on it.
Yep.
Or he had it written down. It was written down on
Yeah,
a
yeah.
piece of paper, slipped inside. He grabs a box and he opens it up, and inside is just a bunch of keys.
Yep.
Like they're all the same.
Yep.
He takes that key, takes the paper out, throws the key inside the box, grabs another key, sticks the paper back in, and we walk up, and he uses that key to open the door next to ours.
Yeah.
So me and my brother are just shocked. So he leaves, and we move our stuff over. We shut the other door, and we stick the key in there, and it unlocks
Yep.
that room.
Yep.
And that led to unlocking other people's rooms. So, long story short, we found out that it was a master key for everybody.
Yeah, so basically, there were you could see where there was electronic key card systems on these doors at one point,
At one point.
but they didn't use them. So what they basically did was the skeleton key that like the maids and stuff would have to get into the rooms. They just made a bunch of copies of those keys. So every key opened every door. Which when I found that out, now I see went out. I just started opening doors. So I busted in on like 2 Dominican families. Like I was just finding a room with AC. But yeah, that was, and because we found out so late, I'm like, oh my goodness, there's days I've left my passport and cash and stuff
Yeah.
here. And so I think the next day, maybe we only had 1 day or maybe 2 days after that. It wasn't very, very many. I was like, I'm taking all that with me.
Yeah.
I'm taking my passport, I'm taking my cash because, anybody can go into these rooms at any time. So it was a great trip. But yeah, we told, and I'm sure back in the day, it might have been a great hotel, but
Right.
we told, and I mean, there were bugs everywhere.
There
It was
was.
part of it. I mean, there's,
I mean, the people were nice. Like the people
oh
who
yeah,
ran it were nice, but
whew, we told brother like, hey, we'll come back. When we come back, we gotta go somewhere. Just from a safety perspective,
yeah,
like we've got to stay somewhere else. It doesn't have to be. It's not really about how nice it is.
yeah,
Like I don't care. I mean, I'm under no illusion.
right,
If it has to be no AC, that's fine. If there's no hot water, that's okay. I
right,
mean, I can do all that.
yeah.
But yeah, it was weird the last night when you're like, okay, we're trying to put the other dog lock on the door and put stuff in front of the door because you're like anybody can just walk
Right,
in anytime.
right. And even those like the door locks that
Yeah,
fold over, those like they were
yeah, it
super
was.
wiggly. So
Yeah, that was that moment when I don't know when we shared that or when we all found out. Hey, everybody know these keys they open
yeah,
any door.
everything.
Yeah, that was that was nuts, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's pretty much it. I think we got a lot talked about. I think there's a lot that can be learned, and
Yeah.
um, but I appreciate it. You being on here and being my first, and
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for having me on. I'm really interested to see, like to hear other people's stories, on the podcast as well, and get a chance to just talk about my life. And it is cool. I don't know that I've ever had the opportunity to kind of talk about it in that kind of linear perspective before.
Mhm.
There's always been times where there's moments,
Right,
and so it's a blessing to me to even talk about it because it's reminded me of like where I've come from,
right.
all the people who I have to think, and the Lord's hand on my life. Now I'm 35 and doing what if you had told me at 14, 15, when I first felt the call, hey, this is what you're gonna be doing,
Mhm.
I would be like, oh my goodness, that's exactly what I want to do.
Right.
And so I'm blessed. I'm blessed to work here. I'm blessed to go on mission trips when I can. I had a great time with you doing that. And my encouragement to anybody who listens to this podcast is if you are kind of on the fence about going on international mission trips, like pray about it. But if you feel called, if God's calling you to go somewhere, just go
Mhm.
because like He'll make a way, the finances will work out, and you will never be the same.
No.
And it's what we're called to do. I was talking about this last night. I'll
Mhm.
I'll, I'll shut up after this, but last night when we were talking about, at the end of the day, God commands us. Jesus
Mhm.
commanded us, go into all the world and make disciples.
Mhm.
And maybe you're listening to this and you physically can't. Although we had a woman that went with us, not from our church, from another church, who was in her 80s.
Mhm.
Esther, she did a great job.
She did.
So, but maybe you have physical things and you physically can't do it. You can send people.
Mhm.
That's important. People, you can't get to these places without money and resources. We took supplies down. We took all kinds of things down. That was a whole. Remember that story where we were trying to get through customs. Anyway,
Yeah.
so we all have a part to play in the kingdom of God. We're all called to go into the nation, make disciples into the
Mhm.
nations. And maybe that's an international mission trip. Maybe that's you in your hometown. Maybe that's you sending someone on a mission trip. Like, it shouldn't all be about one or the other. It shouldn't all be about international missions, because God has appointed you. He's put you in a place in the world to affect change there.
Mm-hmm.
But it also shouldn't be just there. He's also said, it's, you got your Jerusalem, your Samaria, and to the ends of the world. And
Mm-hmm.
if you can find your way as a church, or and specifically as a Christian, to do that, find, you're in your Jerusalem. Okay, what's your Jerusalem? What's your scenario? Samaria? What's your ends of the earth? And where does God want you to go? And if He calls you, just go,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll forever be changed. So thank
Amen.
you, Jordan. I
You're
appreciate you.
welcome. All righty. Well, thanks everybody who listened in, and stay tuned for more.